Hello, I'm going to try something a little bit different today. I'm going to take you through some of the papers that I've been reading, mostly queer. I think I'm going to focus today on the concept of a queer childhood and how that applies to queer pedagogy or the theory of education in Canada here from some papers across a couple decades actually. So these papers start in the 1990s or these ideas start in the 1990s and end fairly recently with some new school policies that have come out. Why do I want to explore the concept of queer? I've been talking a lot about queer, what it means, why are we applying this to children, and why is this even in the classroom? Because I frankly find it quite fascinating. But we're seeing things like this new trans-affirming toolkit for Ontario educators being released, and I'm not sure how that's going to apply to the classroom. I'm not sure which schools, which school boards, which teachers, who's going to be delivering some of this information. I've talked about the toolkit a few times. We gave a bit of a chat about it at the Parents' Rights Coalition of Canada's summit. You can go listen to my talk there. There's some other really great talks actually. If you go to prcoc.ca, you can listen to the other talks. But I focused on queer in that talk, and I'm going to focus on queer again because I do believe at this point that this is the source of the trouble. It is essentially an ideology. It's called queer theory. Quite often with these social sciences called theory, they're not actually theory. So I've come from an empirical science background. Theory usually means when you've done so much research, you've put together all these empirical studies that have been that are falsifiable. So you start with a hypothesis that you must falsify, and over time, when there's such an overwhelming, unfalsifiable, tested body of knowledge, then you have a theory. So that's like the next step. A theory still can be falsified, and we still try to falsify it, which means disprove it. But it's such a well-established body of knowledge that it then becomes a theory. Well, the social sciences theories, they haven't done that. They just called it a theory. They just stepped right over all the hypothesis, all of the testing, all of the rigorous methodology to call itself a theory, to give itself some credibility. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I find that preposterous. So what is it? Let's just have a bit of a start here. The queer, the Q in the LGBTQ has been put in with the LGP, and I find that curious because there was a book called Saint Foucault, and that was published in 1997 from David Halperin. So this book is a defense of Michel Foucault, who's often known as, I think, the grandfather of queer theory. So before queer theory was queer theory, you had the postmodern ideas of Michel Foucault. And so this man was known for eliminating or advocating for the elimination of the age of consent laws. He believed that adults could have perfectly healthy, normal sexual relationships with children. And if you think about that, this is the largest taboo, really, pedophilia, right? The acceptance of pedophilia. So let's hear what David Halperin had to say about queerness in Saint Foucault. He says, unlike gay identity, which, through deliberately proclaimed in an act of affirmation, is nonetheless rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice, queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. I'll just read that again. Queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or any stable reality. As the very word implies, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some determinate object. It acquires its meaning from its oppositional relation to the norm. Its oppositional relation to the norm. Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There's nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. Okay, it is an identity without an essence. So what this is telling you, just to start off, you need to understand that a queer identity is an essence without a norm. It's not grounded in any positive truth or any stable identity. And this theme runs through lots of different research, but let's not take this person's word for it. And also, they're not Canadian. I like to try to focus on Canadian things. The first paper I'm going to have a little bit of a peek at. Oh, and by the way, this is going to be a very superficial overview of some of these papers. If you'd like to go read them, please do. They're much more interesting if you read the entirety. But I'm just going to pull out some quotes from some of these papers just to show you that this idea of queer is pervasive throughout early educational pedagogy in Canada and has been for quite some time. Going to 2006, this is a paper called Queer and Not So Queer Childhoods by Peter E. Cumming. Peter E. Cumming is, I think he's an associate professor emeritus at York University. So that's what I found online. He says, or he describes queer as that he's using queer in this paper despite attendant problems as a non-pejorative umbrella term for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and transsexual people, including children. But more strategically, though, I'm using the term as both adjective and verb, in the sense that Michael Warner calls resistance to regimes of the normal. Sounds really similar to Halperin. Queerness should challenge and confuse our understanding and uses of sexual and gendered categories. So it's about undermining what we already know about gender categories and sexual categories, although he is also including homosexuality in here as well. So this paper is actually discussing queer literature or how to queer literature and how to make it more queer appropriate. And he's referring to this book called Mom and Mum. And I haven't read this book, but I get it's clearly a book about two lesbian mothers. And he says, thus, while Mom and Mum represents queer characters in its two lesbian mothers, its verbal and pictorial depictions inscribe a narrative that does not confuse our understanding and uses of sexual and gendered categories. So it does not confuse us. They're just regular lesbian mums. And it doesn't do that nearly well enough, he says. As a result, its project is not very queer, demonstrating that a homo narrative can be just as conservative and conventional as heteronarrative. What is he saying? He's saying that to be homosexual can be just as conservative and normative, traditional as heterosexual. And so queer, it doesn't mean to be gay. It means to undo anything normal. So you could be gay or homosexual and queer, but only if you are purposefully deconstructing what we understand to be normal and natural, or in this case, what he specifically was talking about our cultural understanding of the uses of sexual and gendered categories. So in this case, this book was not queer enough. It was not, it did not sufficiently undermine, deconstruct, and undo the normal. Let's jump to 2010. And here I have a paper that I've briefly touched on before, actually, in one of the Gender Wars videos. It's from an author, Zeenat Jan Mohammed, from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Now, Jan Mohammed, I believe, is an early childhood education pedagogical researcher in queer theory. She seems to be focused on queer theory. And their thesis, this paper is 2010, but later on they published a thesis at the University of Toronto in 2014 called Getting Beyond Equity and Inclusion, Queering Early Childhood Education. Anyway, Jan Mohammed says in their paper, Queering Early Childhood Studies, Challenging the Discourse of Developmentally Appropriate Practice, they're referring to an author, Kuman Shiro, in 2002. They're saying that this person argued that the norms of schooling and its manifestations can be perceived as oppressive. So schooling and its manifestations can be oppressive. They were arguing that, quote, changing oppression that requires constant working against the norm. So to change oppression, you have to constantly work against the norm. This is the queer part of this paper because, normal schooling, normal is bad, normal is immoral. To queer it means you need to deconstruct, you need to undo everything that's normal. And to undo that oppression, we're now focusing on anti-oppressive education now, you need to constantly be working against it. So she says, the propensity to focus on developmentally appropriate practice seems overbearing and indeed oppressive. I would love if some of the educators who are listening to this, if you're familiar with developmentally appropriate practice, I would love to hear from you, because I've come across this a few times and I haven't had the time to go over it fully. My understanding, very surface level, is this is the idea that children have different developmental phases. And so the types of subjects and the way that you teach those subjects must be appropriate for that developmental phase. So if you're an educator and that's totally incorrect, then I'd love to hear from you. And this is back in 2010 that she's talking about this. But I've come across this idea a few times that developmentally appropriate practice, that is oppressive. This is a really awful thing, and we need to stop doing it immediately because we need to undermine this norm. So she continues saying, Jan Mohammed continues by saying, children's identities would be better understood through a critical deconstruction of Western theories of child development and of the normative pedagogical frameworks that dominate in early childhood practice. So Jan Mohammed here is specifically talking about I think when she's talking about Western theories, she's and criticizing developmentally appropriate practice, what she's doing is saying, okay, maybe there's some studies that says that sexualizing childhood is a bad idea, but we need to deconstruct that because it's oppressive, and we're going to queer this curriculum here. So that was, again, back in 2010. Oh, let me just add a little bit from Jan Mohammed's paper. She quotes Butler. She says that Butler argued that gender formations are performative. So gender formations are performative, very Butler. We're performing our gender, life is drag, drag is life. And views gender not as a natural biological attribute, but as a collection of repeated acts that over time can constitute gender of the subject. So very, very Butler-like. We're, like I said, we're all performing drag. I wear a dress, that means I'm a woman. I don't know, whatever stereotype you want to associate with being a woman makes me a woman. She says the early childhood years are undoubtedly the most important time of life to expose children to a variety of life options that should not be limited to dominant ways of knowing. Children very much absorb things, they copy, they want to be like their mentors. And so what Jan Mohammed is saying is that we need to queer childhood, we need to prepare children, to give them generative themes, to introduce them to queer modes of being, alternate modes of kinship, etc., etc. Not doing so is oppressive because children absorb things. And so because we know children absorb things really young, then we need to do that as early as possible. And not doing so is oppressive. Never forget, not doing so is oppressive. So educators who can challenge the dominant discourse of normative forms of childhood development can develop curriculum and practice that provides opportunities to explore safely the fluidity of gender roles and how normal, in bunny quotes, it is for children to explore this. I'm going to actually touch on this a little bit later in this podcast, but essentially she's saying, okay, well, how can we make queerness appropriate? Not appropriate. Well, is queerness even appropriate at this age? Well, yes, she's assumed that it is. And how can we deliver that to young children? I find it interesting. She talks about exploring it safely, because is it safe to introduce children to sexuality? But never mind. In a nutshell, the rest of the paper actually focuses quite a lot on queer families. I think Jan Mohammed focuses very much on the idea that because certain families have decided to adopt a queer lifestyle, then we have to be inclusive. And so we have to teach queer modes of existing, etc., etc. But what does that mean? What does it mean to queer early childhood education exactly? Because that was back in 2010, and I don't think there was a huge amount of that actually going on in the classroom itself. I thought this was very theoretical at the time, so these ideas existed in the academe, but not necessarily in the classroom. Well, let's move on to a more recent paper. This one is Queer Futurity and Childhood Innocence, Beyond the Injury of Development. This is from Hannah Dyer. At the time, I believe it was at possibly Carleton University. Oh, she might be there now, I can't remember. But this is another Canadian academic. In the title itself, it's telling you that she's going to deconstruct childhood innocence. I'm going to, I think, do another video focusing on childhood innocence and its links with queer theory. But I'm not going to really go on too much about that in today's podcast. Hannah describes in 2017 as many of the arguments made in the field of childhood education concerning children's sexualities, though, tend to stabilize queerness as identity, instead of preserving something contingent as a site of collective contestation. Again, this is bringing you back to the Saint-Foucault, the idea that queer is a site of collective contestation. It's not preserving something contingent. This is about it's the identity without an essence. Again, it is it is this thing that we cannot describe that we're undoing. So we're not creating something, we're undoing. Dyer goes on to say, I employ queer to both A, classify sexuality, and B, reference deviance from cultural norms. Well, is it a sexuality or a deviance from cultural norms? Because those are very, very, very different things that don't really go together. But she says, thus, children who self-identify or are identified with the LGBTQ culture may be considered queer. But queer childhood should not be constrained to identificatory regimes or an assumption of the stability of sex or gender. To be queer, you should not make assumptions that anything is stable. Sex or gender. Well, sex, I'm female. I had a child, so I gave birth, so I clearly have female gametes. And although I've never tested my chromosomes, I'm quite sure they're XX. I think I'm a normal female in that regard. So you shouldn't assume that that's stable. That's what they're saying. Now, gender, we know from Butler, it's performance. We are performing femininity because somehow femininity is different from my female self. And so I guess you could make some kind of argument for that. But if you're destabilizing reality, this is concerning. And this is an academic who teaches teachers. She goes on to say, I borrow from queer theory's insistence that queerness is that which undoes identity, not what holds it together. I'll just read that again. Dyer in 2017 about children in early education says, I borrow from queer theory's insistence that queerness is that which undoes identity, not that which holds it together. We are talking about very young children and the desire to undo their identity. This raises enormous red flags for me. Adults is one thing, but young children, this is early years education. She goes on to say, I am not interested in only promoting queer as a category of identity that promises social cohesion. Rather, I'm thinking with Dana George's 2013, some paper I haven't read, this person's notion of queer affects as the return of memory and desire discarded for its ability to undo social identity. So we're getting a bit philosophical. It's all about undoing. It's all about destroying. It's all about deconstruction. It's all, we're just going to get rid of all this stuff. We're not going to build it up with anything else because we're just going to get rid of it. And she says, queer affect for Georges is what agitates our ability to fully know ourselves. And its presence is a result of memory, fantasy, and loss discarded because it is difficult to bear. Again, we're talking about children, and Dyer in 2017 is writing about educating children that they want to promote queerness because not doing so is oppressive, but it is specifically something that agitates your ability to fully know yourself. They're agitating children's ability to fully know themselves. In this formulation, she goes on to say, queer is not what makes us recognizable to the other. It is what undoes us. And what here can work to undo the innocent child? What more can be said? Here it's work that can be done to undo the innocent child. She is referring to this idea that childhood innocence is a myth that needs to be undone. Again, I'll focus on that a little bit more in another video. Just before I move on from Dyer, she believes that innocence is a concept that oppresses the child and limits their queer potential, basically. So this normative idea, because again, queer theory is all about undoing anything that's normal and trying to preserve childhood as an innocent time where people are essentially asexual and don't have sexuality, don't think about sexuality, just want to play. Well, that's a normative idea, and Dyer doesn't like that very much. So let me just read a little bit from the very introduction. I think this is even in the abstract or just after. She says, I begin with engagement of Eve Sedgwick's 1991 seminal essay on queer childhood, How to Bring Up Your Kids Gay. And then from there, trace contemporary queer theory's use of the figure of the child and consideration of the impact of, quote unquote, innocence on childhood. So we need to have that innocence, the innocence in quotes, in an effort to consider the contemporary residues of historical violence on theories of, quote unquote, healthy child development. So there's a hostility here to innocence and having a healthy child development, or they know better than what already exists. This idea of developmentally appropriate practice again rears its head. So just a heads up on that. Okay, so moving on, we're just going to go back in time a little bit here. We're going to go to a paper in 2009. This is from David Ruffalo, and he is at Ryerson University. I don't know if he's still there, but this paper was written while he was at Ryerson University in the School of Early Childhood Education. All these queer theories popping up in early childhood education. Isn't that fun? So his paper is called Queering Child/Hood Policies, Canadian Examples and Perspectives. So let's read a little bit from this paper. Ruffalo says, queer theory has created many theoretical, philosophical, and practical spaces to critically think about how subjects are constituted, negotiated, and circulated in early childhood education. It offers tools to disturb normative practices and binary ideologies by exposing how there are no fixed and stable bodies that are essentially normal. I find it interesting. Obviously, they're going to disturb normative practices because they're queer theorists, but this idea of the binary ideology, there's a hostility to science here. They call it, I think, scientific essentialism. It's just one way of knowing, like Jan Mohammed talked about the various ways of knowing. Science is just one among many, and it's an ideology. You know, it's not the best way of understanding the world that we've ever come up with as humans, and the reason why we've innovated over the last couple hundred years and been really successful at it. No, it's not that. It's just an ideology, and it's based in this idea of this binary ideology, like there's just male and female, right? So that needs to be exposed. We need to disturb that idea, because to them, there's no fixed and stable bodies that are essentially normal. That doesn't exist. We don't have any proof of that because we're queer theorists. We call it a theory, even though we've never tested a hypothesis. But because we call it a theory, that makes us really clever. And because we have PhDs, that makes us even smarter. So believe us. So there's no such thing as the binary, a sex binary at all. So yeah, don't believe that. And he goes on to say, to think of subjects in such a way significantly removes the social, cultural, and political and economic influences of identity formation. It contrastingly exposes how bodies become normatively essentialized. Normatively essentialized. Again, a critique of just reality. What is considered quote unquote normal and quote unquote essential is in fact a complex networking of social, cultural, political, and economic desires that seek to produce what it means to be normal. So right off the bat, this paper is classing, what it's trying to do is to, again, just really deconstruct anything that's normal. And so they're going to do their very best to try to convince the reader that this idea of normal is really all in your head and it doesn't really mean anything. And it's this social construction that I'm sure you've heard about. If we just deconstruct that, if we just create all these arguments for why this idea of normal is really oppressive and we can convince you of that, then we can take all of these things that we consider to be abnormal and put them in the center. So we're going to center the marginal, because doing anything other than that is oppressive. But I'll take you, so the reason I have a real issue with this in early childhood education is because, again, they keep talking about throughout some of these papers that their goal is to deconstruct all these things and is to confuse and to undo identities. And we're talking about small children here. But beyond that, we're also, if I take you back to Halperin and Foucault, the celebration of Foucault, what is the most abnormal thing that you can do, or the most taboo thing that you can do? Well, it's pedophilia. The people who essentially have a history of creating queer theory want to celebrate the most abnormal thing. It's the whole point of queer theory, is to queer. I mean, queer, by the way, just means strange. I know they adopted it or took it back from the negative connotation when we used to call gay people queer as a bad thing, but it also just means strange. And it's a perfect way of calling or describing queer theories, to make things strange, to strange things, right? And what is stranger than wanting to have sexual conversations in secret between an adult teacher and a small child? Anyway, I'm going off on topic here. Just sometimes reading this stuff makes me a little bit annoying. Moving on to probably my favorite quote in my favorite paper so far. This is from the University of British Columbia, so UBC, an author, Harper Keenan, obvious queer theorist, and another queer pedagogy academic. He wrote a paper in 2021, which you may have heard of, called Drag Pedagogy, the Playful Practice of Queer Imagination in Early Childhood. Now, the paper itself is amusing to read, a justification of why you need adult men dressed as women gyrating in front of children as a mean to educate. They even say in the paper, this is not about educating them at all. It's about creating generative themes, and is to generate interest in living queerly. That's essentially what the paper is saying. So it's not about educating kids at all. It's about, introducing them to queer modes of living. But anyway, in the conclusion, they say, we believe that Drag Queen Story Hour offers an invitation towards deeper public engagement with queer cultural production, particularly for young children and their families. It may be that Drag Queen Story Hour is quote unquote family friendly in the sense that it is accessible and inviting to families with children. It may be, but it's less a sanitizing force than it is a preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. Here, Drag Queen Story Hour is quote unquote family friendly in the sense of quote unquote family as an old school queer code for identifying and connecting with other queers in the street. Now, they are talking about Drag Queen Story Hour here, but this is essentially what Queer in the Classroom is also. It's not really about being age appropriate, because we don't like developmentally appropriate practice. That's bad. It is about generating queerness in young people. So, I mean, when people say they're transing your kids, I don't know, Harper Keenan, if you're listening to this, it could be because of when we read things like that, that is essentially saying you're queering these kids. Anyway, please do go read that paper. It's Drag Pedagogy, the Playful Practice of Queer Imagination in Early Childhood. Okay, so we've spent some time examining the academics, but okay, it's in academic papers. Who cares? It's in some academic's mind who doesn't believe in actually testing their ideas. But why does this matter for the classroom? Why does it matter for education itself, the actual students themselves? Recently, the University of Western Ontario released the Trans-Affirming Toolkit, and the intent of this toolkit is to provide resources to educators, because apparently there's a lack of resources, to help them support trans students. Now, it is heavily focused on trans, or it uses trans a lot, but I really felt that this toolkit was queer theory focused. And also another area of focus is intersectional identity politics. I guess altogether you could call that anti-oppressive education. But essentially it's based in queer theory. The people putting together this toolkit, they will understand what queer is. Now, let me remind you, just from what we read about queer theory and the educators themselves, the way they described queer, is that it's an identity without an essence. It is about deconstructing everything that we consider to be normal. It's about confusing identity. It's about deconstructing the very essence of who you are, right? And so they know this. They'll be very well educated in this material. So the Trans-Affirming Toolkit had a survey before they actually put out the toolkit, and it places queer as a sexual orientation. They know that it's not really a sexual orientation, it's an identity. The reason I bring this up is simply because, to me, this is focusing on this false presumption that it's a sexual orientation, because what is the orientation towards what sex? How is queer a sex? It's not a sex. So they know that that's not what it is, but they place it in that category because homophobia exists. And so people are very sensitive to homophobia. They know that it's been a problem in the past. And so if you place queer as a sexual orientation, you get a lot more sympathy for it, even though it's about completely deconstructing people's ideas or deconstructing the very essence of what it means to be a person. One of the respondents in this survey said, "We need more curriculum surrounding the diverse LGBTQIA plus identities, queer-focused sex ed, and programming for teachers to learn themselves the best practice for supporting queer trans students." What is queer-focused sex ed? Queer-focused sex ed. So if it's about sex ed and it's queer and it's about deconstructing everything that's normal, perceived as normal, and it's an identity without an essence, and we want to center everything that is the most abnormal and the most taboo, well, what does that lead to? At its most benign, I guess, would be certain levels of kink, deconstructing gender and sex, like Cummings said. So trans, this is the trans-affirming toolkit. Trans is a queer identity because it is about deconstructing the idea of sex and gender, as they say. But also the kink aspect of that is another logical step. And if you follow that all the way down the line, we are going all the way down to the pedophilia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just something to be aware of. I don't know how much they think about this, but it's not a sexual orientation is the point I'm trying to make. In the toolkit itself, in the very beginning, there's a little quick tip. It says words have different impacts and meanings to different people, and it's important to be aware of the context before putting language that is new to us into use. It is important to take a moment and research the current use of terms to make sure that you are using the right words for the right context. Okay, let's go have a little look at the glossary of terms. So this is a glossary from the 519, which is an activist organization in Toronto. The glossary terms here, they place queer as an umbrella term used and reclaimed by some whose sexual orientation and or gender identities fall outside of cisgender straight norms. I guess you could say that's in part perhaps a little bit of queer, but that's not what we've just described in all of the previous, the beginning bit of this podcast here, when we described it as the deconstruction of normal, the identity without an essence. That's not at all. Celebrating sexual orientations and gender identities that fall out of cisgender and straight norms is just like a symptom of what queer is. That's just an extension of what happens when you adopt queerness. The point of me bringing this up is that the 519 they know exactly what queer is, but they choose to present it in a way that is much more benign and can garner much more sympathy from the average person, because they're just saying queer is just being different. But it's much more than that, as we've explored. We often hear about misinformation. Well, this is essentially misinformation to garner empathy and sympathy for your cause. Part of what they're trying to do in the trans-affirming toolkit is, I guess you could say, challenging bias. And there's a resource in this challenge to make sure that you're challenging your own bias. And it's from Queer Sex Ed. Well, what is Queer Sex Ed? And here, this particular resource, it says, no one is too young for queer representation. Growing up, it is important to see yourself reflected in the world around you. This is how we grow and learn and feel like we can find our place in the world. Straight and or cis kids get this from every form of media. So why, whenever we talk about queer representation, does the conversation begin to skew towards arguments of age appropriateness, in quotes? So the article goes on to deconstruct the whole idea that nobody's too young, age appropriateness isn't really a thing, it's a white supremacist idea. And again, this is, the gentle introduction. So they're a bit more honest about queer as they go down. We're trying to undo that whole concept of age appropriateness because that's so oppressive, and it's not representing the people who want to embrace all their kink. And the other idea that I haven't really touched on much here is just that because adults have self-selected an identity, because it is an identity without an essence, to adopt that queer identity, then that means they must have been a queer child at some point. And so there is no such thing as age appropriateness, because if that queer adult exists, it must have been a queer child. And so it's oppressive not to introduce all children to the idea of queerness, which is really just a form of cognitive dissonance. So, if you're following me on that, this is just a evidence, I guess. So here's another illustration of why I believe the Trans-Affirming Toolkit and its survey are based in queer theory. Trans studies, another critical theory-based philosophy, I guess, epistemology, is a thing. It's slightly separate from queer pedagogy or queer theory. It is slightly apart, and it has its own way of describing the world, and it is very much based on deconstructing male and female and what is femininity and masculinity, and so on and so forth. But the queer theory aspect of that is the deconstruction of the normal, right? And so I guess you could slightly distinguish the two in that way. Where queer can talk about sex and gender, it can also talk about just about anything else. It's really about deconstructing and undoing everything that we consider to be normal, because that's oppressive. That element of that is seen in this toolkit when they talk about things like cisgenderism. When we think about racism, it's that ism places it in the category of it's oppressive. So we've heard that a few times about how not being queer is oppressive, or assuming that people are not queer is oppressive. So this cis, it's just a word that has been adopted that means normal. You need to place that normal, that cis, in the position of oppression, in the position of being cis is immoral even, so that you can deconstruct it to center the marginal, the trans. Their description of cisgenderism is a pervasive ideology. Being normal is a pervasive ideology that denigrates and denies the legitimacy of self-assigned gender identities. I guess I'm a cisgenderist. It's preying on people's desire to be empathetic. It also provides an opportunity to do that deconstruction work that they want to do in a way that seems more legitimate. Because if you're just telling people that you want to deconstruct everything, you want to cause cognitive dissonance and so on and so forth, they'll be like, hell no, who wants to do that? But if you place it in a context that makes it seem like this is really legitimate and it is about helping poor, vulnerable, marginalized people to just be more comfortable in the world, then that is an easier sell. But it's completely rubbish. And the people writing this, they know it's complete rubbish. And there's a whole suite of papers, even just written on cissexism and cisgenderism. What is cissexism? They say it's a set of values, beliefs, and actions that state that cisgender identities are the only normal and natural identities. See the normal and natural again? And that identities that any other gender identity is deviant and unnatural. Therefore, the policed, regulated, and rectified for transgressing the natural order of gender, aligning with sex. It's very poorly written. I'm very sorry that came out that way. But the whole point is that they are paranoid about this idea of cis being normal and natural because, well, the vast majority, they say themselves like 1% of the population is trans. So that would mean, by their figures, 99% of the population is cis. That does make it normal and natural. But to them, that is immoral. That is bad. They're projecting their own resentment towards people who are normal and natural, because I guess in their mind, I'm cis. I don't view my cisness as oppressing them just because it's normal and natural. I'm not placing a moral value on not being cis, on being trans, simply because I'm not that, right? But they're doing that. That's what they're doing. They're saying that it is sexist. We need to regulate and rectify, blah, blah, blah. And they talk about the transgressing of the natural order. And they put natural in quotations, obviously, because the whole point, it's so funny that they kind of place it in this way, that the transgressing of that natural order that creates this is sexism, because that's the whole point of queer theory. It's the transgression. It is about transgressing everything that they particularly view as natural and normal, because they view those categories as oppressive. Anyway, I'm going in circles, but I think it's important to understand that it doesn't just stay in the academics. The argument I'm trying to make here is that it gets softened for the audience of educators. And then that down the line will get softened again for the students. But we can see from the academics that it's far more insidious than they try to paint it as. I'm going to take you now to a different document. This is the York Region Gender Expression and Identity Guidelines. Sorry, the York Region District School Board's Gender Identity Guidelines. They hired the 519, the same organization as in the very beginning of the Trans Affirming Toolkit, who I described queer as very softened version of it. So the 519 also provides a glossary description of queer. Here, they say that queer is a term used by some 2S LGBTQ communities, particularly youth, as a symbol of pride and affirmation of diversity. This term makes space for the expression of a variety of identities outside the rigid categories associated with sex, gender, or attraction. It can also be used by a community to encompass a broad spectrum of identities related to sex, gender, or attraction, or by an individual to reflect the interrelatedness of all aspects of their identity. There's a lot of words here. It's saying queer is just being different. We've explored that is not what queer means. It's much more than that. Being different is just a sort of a side effect of queer. They again don't describe what queering means. And especially when we're talking about children, it is alarming. It is about creating a sense of no identity, deconstructing people's, it's destabilizing their sense of self at the very core. That is what queering is. And so you could do the same thing, like the transgression of the natural order, I guess, in when they talk about literature here, right? So when we think about some of the sexually inappropriate books in school, like that's queering the literature. I suppose you could even queer medicine, and that's the alternate ways of knowing. And so anything that's normal, so the normal empirical method in science, you could queer that, and you could introduce the multiple ways of knowing, right? The abnormal. So there's loads of ways of queering things. It's not just sex and identity, but it's very focused in that. But the point of me saying this is that the 519, they're activists, they're trans activists, queer activists, LGBTQ activists. They know what queering is, but they are softening it every time they present it in a school environment. And then that will get softened again for the kids. In my personal opinion, this is the same as misinformation. So just another point that I like to bring up whenever I talk about the YRDSB gender identity document. I love their description of cisgender. By love, I mean loathe. Let's just read it. It says cisgender, a person whose gender corresponds with social expectations associated with their sex. Cisgender, not transgender, is a person whose gender corresponds with the social expectations associated with their sex. I guess a social expectation could be a girl wears a dress, or a girl likes to paint her nails. If you correspond with that, then you're cisgender. But if a girl likes to throw a ball around, or if she's a tomboy, then that doesn't follow the social expectation. And so if she's not cisgender, the alternative to that would be transgender. So they're saying if a girl doesn't wear dresses, she's trans. I always like to point this out because it's absolute rubbish. The entire document is written by activists. Like I said, the 519 is an activist organization, but just another element here. They have this intersectional wheel of oppression. It's just done in a different way. In this case, it was by Dr. Nixon, who they themselves are an activist. It says in their bio, Dr. Nixon was a psychotherapist, global health researcher, and activist scholar for the last 25 years. Much of her research explores how systems of oppression shape health research, education, and practice, and the role of people in positions of unearned advantage in disrupting these harmful patterns. It's just more activists. It's activist upon activist upon activist writing these documents for schools. They have the nerve in these documents to talk about undoing bias. If I bring you back, actually, I didn't read this one earlier. I'm going to read it now. It says in one of the respondents for the Trans Affirming Toolkit survey, it says, I don't think these policies really look at the barriers which trans folks face. The policies are not about uncovering and challenging biases. But these documents are so biased. They are so biased that they don't even hypothesize and test the own academics behind the research publishing these policies and guidelines and documents. The bias goes all the way to the top of the academics. It's unbelievable. The bias in the way of this idea. This is an ideology. They call binary an ideology, but this is an ideology where it is not based in any falsifiable fact. It is simply based on people's ideas that keep perpetuating themselves, right? When they talk about modes of production, this is they want to produce because in their minds, essentially they believe that heteronormativity. So the idea of being normal and heterosexual is something that, if unchallenged, reproduces itself within society because of oppression. What they're trying to do is disrupt that. They view that as bias. By disrupting that, they want to introduce their own mode of cultural production, which is queer. Well, they're doing what they're saying other people are doing. It's entirely projection, and then doing the exact same thing for essentially to gain power, because the obsession with not having power. It's very circular, but this is the stuff in schools. These are the examples taken directly from schools, from the academic institutions, all the way down to school boards. Well, yeah, school boards in this case. I guess a toolkit is just for anyone to use as they wish at the minute. I didn't really include examples directly in classrooms, but Chanel Fall on Twitter has so many examples of this stuff manifesting itself within actual classrooms. You're welcome to go and have a look at Chanel's Twitter to see those examples. I'm not going to go through them here. If this was useful to you and you enjoyed it and you'd like me to do more, please let me know. Maybe leave a comment, maybe a like, subscribe maybe to help the algorithm. Have a good one, and hopefully I will speak to you soon.